Welcome to The General and the Journalist, our new podcast from The Times and The Sunday Times. And we usually begin by saying the old global order is breaking down, conflicts on the rise, and the world is getting ever more dangerous. But the people behind the UK's Strategic Defence Review, no less, have their own description. The international chessboard has been tipped over, kings and queens, knights, castles, pawns, all scrambling to make sense of it.
And we're here every week to make sense of that worrying world. And today we're going to unpack the Defence Review, which has been written to address just those new threats. And as always, Patrick, the general part of the equation is you, General Sir Patrick Sanders, who was Chief of the General Staff until last year, head of the British Army nonetheless, and now a civilian again.
And you're the journalist half, Tom Newton-Dunn, a former war correspondent, defence editor, and political editor.
So how are you, Patrick?
I'm very well, thanks, Tom. Thank you for asking.
I think we're both a bit sleep deprived, aren't we? Because it's been quite an intense week. We've both been immersed in 140 pages of reading through this defence review, 46,000 words, like a small novel, all about military strategy, technical detail, and talk of profound change to come for armed forces in the future.
Yeah, and there's so much to admire in the Strategic Defence Review. It is unquestionably an excellent blueprint for making Britain safer in a very, very dangerous world, but not in time. Most of what this recommends won't happen until well into the 30s, and almost every threat assessment says that we need to be ready this decade.
So that's the question we're going to ask today, isn't it? After years of underinvestment, is Britain running out of time to get its defences in order before we could have to start using them in a major war? Now, what are strategic defence views? We should briefly say, well, they're a general overhaul, a look under the bonnet of how our forces are configured. They usually happen every decade or so. They're happening a bit more often, actually, in the last 10, 15 or so years. And they're supposed to set out a vision for what our defence setup should look like over the next decade, as this one does too, with its full vision taking effect in 2035.
Yeah, and in normal times, that might have been fine. But of course, as we're hearing, as the report says, these aren't normal times. And the Defence Secretary, John Healey, said it himself in the report. He said, the threats we now face are more serious and less predictable than at any time since the Cold War.
And there's the problem in a nutshell, really, isn't it? Because it's not just John Healey, it's sweeping great announcements by the Prime Minister on Monday when he launched it as well, alerting us to the need for urgent action. But far too little of it is actually in any of this review or what the government have said alongside it to back that up with delivery. It doesn't mean, though, and we need to be honest about this, that the SDR, as the colloquialism goes, is all bad. In fact, far from it. It's fascinating, for example, on new technologies like laser weapons, how we use drones and how it's all integrated with all the different systems in the air, on the ground, etc. that we have.
Yeah, and I think if we are being fair, we should acknowledge that this report is both historic and it's really ambitious. So it's the first time in the last 6 defence reviews that there won't be cut to troop numbers, for example. In fact, it says specifically there should be no further reductions to the numbers of regulars across the 3 services. That, incidentally, is not where we started. So as we were making the early steps in this review, when I was still in my last role, there was a very strong view held within the MOD and across Whitehall that there should be a further reduction in the army, up to 10,000. And that hasn't happened.
Frustrating for you, Patrick, that the year you retire from the British Army, having served for 40 years under cuts, suddenly someone starts putting numbers up again.
I'm delighted that my successor, Rolly Walker, is going to be in a position to be the first CGS who's actually looking at investment.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
Diplomatically too.
And of course, it recommends an increase in the reserve forces as well, but only when that's affordable, and that's one of the flaws. Secondly, it's the first review since the end of the Cold War that says unequivocally that the armed forces need to be ready for a large-scale and protracted war. That's really significant. It clearly prioritises defence and security in our own neighbourhood. That's the NATO first moniker, and that's over other parts of the world like the Indo-Pacific. And it's really clear on just how radically technology is transforming warfare. It says that armed forces that do not change at the same pace as technology quickly risk becoming obsolete. And there are some big initial announcements that we've heard already from the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary. So building up to 12 nuclear attack submarines, 7,000 new long-range missiles, 15 billion into the sovereign nuclear warhead programme. And really importantly, it addresses a lot of the unsexy but important enablers and foundations.
Okay, they're the good bits. There are also the bad bits, which we're going to get onto. And it's also strangely mute on things that we were very much expecting to hear. An additional way of delivering our nuclear deterrent, for example, a ballistic missile defence system for the entire UK, which is woefully lacking at the moment. And that's something we're going to get into in a bit more detail.
Yeah, but above all, my real concern is this isn't a plan. It's clearly been put through the Whitehall blanderizer. There are almost no hard dates, no deadlines, no lists of capabilities, and those are the things that will give effect to the ambition. So that means yet more delay as the MOD works all of this out in its next step and then gets into haggling with itself and the Treasury. And the vagueness behind this means that delivery can be endlessly deferred.
So in summary, it's more of a grand, beautifully put together and lovely written wish list than any actual plan. At this stage, I'm going to apologise to you, Patrick, because you have been inside the MOD, inside the British Army for 40 years. You probably lost count of the amount of defence reviews you've had to sit through and work on. So what's it actually like in the inside to put one of these things together?
Yeah, I mean, I've been closely involved, I think, in four. I mean, it's a nightmare. There's no other way to put it. And I'm not even one of the high priests. I'm one of the people that just sort of contributes to this. So the way you think about an SDR is to think about the 5 stages of grief. So the first stage is denial.
That bad?
Oh, God, not again. And the reason people think not again is that when an SDR starts, it paralyzes all decision making. So you can't get any approvals for any new capabilities through unless they're incredibly, incredibly urgent. So it imposes delay. It slows everything down. Then you move on to the next stage, anger, because it diverts attention from delivery, because you get these dire threats of cuts that are always thrown out there. It's divisive. It pits the services against each other quite often.
Which is something you love doing at the best of times.
No, I mean, we really don't. And then you end up with poor staff officers and civil servants who just go through endless redrafting and fettling of the various propositions and plans. Then you get to bargaining. This is very much a performative process. So the services are encouraged to present bold, ambitious visions for the future. The centre or the Treasury say, no, don't be ridiculous. And occasionally you get moments of theatre, as I had, where I had to sort of perform in a sort of Dragon's Den type affair at the Tower of London with Ben Wallace sort of scoring, and I half expected to be fired by Ben Wallace at the end of it.
Hold on a minute there. That's going to take a little bit of unpacking. Dragon's Den at the Tower of London. I mean, literally, where was it? How did it?
It was in the Tower of London.
In a dungeon?
No, in a room in the Tower of London. It did have windows. There were no bars on the windows, and each of us had to go in and pitch our vision of the future.
Did you have to do a jig, sing a song?
Almost. Anyway, that's the bargaining. So that takes you to the next stage, which is depression, because you realise that everything you've worked on is a complete waste of time, and their view will prevail. And then the thing is announced, and that's when you get to acceptance, where you have to loyally make the best of it and then go out and defend it, as one of my successors had to do to a cut of 10,000 to the army.
The 5 stages of grief stroke a strategic defence review. So look, from my perspective, from a political journalist, a defence journalist, for then covering umpteen of these as well, 7 or 8, I think, actually, from over 20 years. What is the most wonderful thing is we take calls, we have lunches, we have WhatsApp messages from generals. Never you, I should make the very important point.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks.
On the record. But from generals, from ministers, from Secretary of States, bitterly briefing against the Treasury and sometimes number 10, saying this is disgraceful what they're going to do. You've got to write about this. You've got to stop this from happening. Throw in the red arrows there. They're going to cut that too. That's always an old chestnut that comes up as well as the Guards divisions, which the royal family love and always have to intervene over. And then comes the day of the review being published, and the exact same generals and particularly politicians stand up proudly and say, this is the most wonderful thing I've ever seen, when only the night before they were moaning bitterly about it.
Yeah. That's acceptance. You have to go out and defend it. That's what we're paid to do.
Okay, let's get to our question then. Is Britain running out of time? So to answer that, I think we need to look at the challenge, don't we? The real and actual threats we and our allies in NATO are now facing in the world in 2025. Patrick, do you think this review gives a fair assessment of those threats? Yeah,
I think this is the most honest and realistic assessment that I've seen in any strategic defence review. I mean, the only thing that's really missing, I think, is an assessment of the time frame that these threats are going to materialise in. But we have got plenty of those from our allies, and particularly those who really understand the threat from Russia, so the Nordics and the Balts and the Eastern Europeans, but also China, Iran and North Korea.
But lots of use of the word wartime, or as John Healey, the Defence Secretary, was saying, a pre-war era that we're now in. And you'd agree with that?
I mean, I've used that language myself. In some respects, I think that we're in war already. We're in a war. Certainly Russia sees it that way. I mean, Russia sees itself as being involved in a generational existential struggle with the West. And of course, it's waging different forms of warfare, albeit below the threshold that would trigger Article 5, in lots of different domains. So whether that's assassinations, subversions, cyber attacks, all the stuff that we read about. Now, Russia is currently fixed by Ukraine. Ukraine are doing us an enormous service. It's why, in this review, the single most important thing it should recommend is that we keep supporting Ukraine so that we prevent a Russian victory. I mean, a Russian victory would be terrible, not just for Ukraine, but also for Europe. But if we assume that there is going to be a ceasefire, Russia's war economy means that it can restore its armed forces, it can rearm much faster than Europe can on current progress. And of course, it doesn't need to restore them fully if it's going to seize some limited objectives, for example, in the Baltics, which of course it sees as part of the historic territories of Russia. And these are small countries and they don't have much depth, so they're difficult to defend.
3 more little Ukraines.
Yeah. So if a ceasefire happens this year, most assessments agree that the Russians could be ready by 2029, but for a more limited objective, they could be ready much sooner. And of course, there's a lot of incentive for Russia not to wait until NATO is ready and rearmed. You know, would Germany have sat back and said, oh, it's right, we'll wait for you. Well, you know, we wouldn't do anything until 1946. It's pretty unlikely. And then if we look to the other side of the world, all the reports are that China is getting its military and its economy ready for reacquiring, for an invasion potentially of Taiwan. Now, the Strategic Defence Review calls China a sophisticated and persistent challenge. That's quite delicate, careful language. But on this podcast, the former British Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, told us that he thinks President Xi is getting ready for reunification or invasion, to use another word, as early as 2027 or 2028.
And it could be earlier than 2027, could it? Simon Case also told us a couple of weeks ago that he thinks it could be a lot more imminent than that. Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary at the Shangri-La Dialogue, a defense conference in Singapore this week, also used the word imminent about China's plans for Taiwan. So this is getting really very, very actual and present as a threat, isn't it?
And these dates really matter. So you could end up with this Axis powers, if you think of it in those terms, so Russia and China, indeed supported potentially by Iran and North Korea, collaborating to create a polycrisis, a war on two fronts. So you start with a large-scale confrontation in the Indo-Pacific, which draws off what remains of, or the most substantial important bits of US forces in Europe.
This is with the Chinese invasion of Taiwan.
Exactly. And then you end up with an opportunistic Russian move against some part of NATO territory where they know they can actually win by achieving local dominance. And that feels like the Baltics or somewhere in the high north like Svalbard. And then having done that, a quick seizure of limited objectives, limited territory, they sit back behind a nuclear umbrella and they dare NATO to act. Now that's incredibly high stakes, but the payoff for Putin would be very, very high. He'd be able to regain Russian lands, and it means effectively the end of NATO unless NATO responds. So it's double jeopardy with global consequences.
It really is a nightmare scenario as well. How much does that worry the MOD and NATO?
I mean, it really worries them. I mean, these are scenarios that they will be thinking through and wargaming. And it's why trying to manage NATO unity at the forthcoming summit is going to be so critical.
We should also talk about the US as well as part of the threat. Obviously, they're still an ally. But in terms of how much the US would come to our aid, especially in Europe these days, that was obviously guaranteed for 80 years since the Second World War. Under Donald Trump and also other US politicians who are far more isolationists, that's no longer a guarantee anymore, certainly not in Europe. So that has to come into the thinking in terms of the threats, and it will then elevate those potential threats if Uncle Sam isn't necessarily by our side.
It's why the NATO summit, I must say it again, it's why the NATO summit matters so much, because we want to make sure that we support the US and in pivoting towards its priorities in the Indo-Pacific, but that pivot away is done in a way that allows it to be manageable.
And of course, it's not just Russia and China as well. The SDR is also pretty good on the real possibilities of other threats to global security, germ warfare, climate change, terrorism, things have been around for quite a long time. Demographic change, mass movement of people. Iran, that's a huge issue yet to be resolved with the nuclear standoff. North Korea, the list is pretty long.
Yeah. But I think the problem that lies at the heart of this SDR is that it's trying to reconcile the tension between laying the foundations for their future and addressing these short and medium-term threats to Europe and Taiwan that we've been discussing. Now, both of those are clearly important, but the latter, the immediate term, is more urgent. And I don't think it's got that balance right. Now, the authors themselves in the report say that, and I'll quote, "A focus on exquisite capabilities has masked the hollowing out of the armed forces' warfighting capability." And in some ways, I think this SDR perpetuates that. If you look at where most of the investment is going, it's on precisely these sort of exquisite, very expensive capabilities, which don't arrive until the 2030s or the 2040s. So that's the nuclear warhead program. It's the Global Combat Aircraft Program, GCAP. It's the AUKUS submarines. And you should remember that the nuclear enterprise, the combination of the warhead, the whole thing, the infrastructure of the warhead, the submarines, the delivery systems, that takes 40% of the defense spending on equipment.
Okay, so even under this defense view, which is very good on the threats, we won't be ready for war.
No, and the report acknowledges it. So the answer is to make the existing force that we have, which we're going to be stuck with for some time, much more lethal, and to develop the stockpiles much more quickly than we are. Now, one of the highlights, one of the bright spots in this is a really important announcement on the establishment of something that the MOD calls a digital targeting web. Now, I would describe that as a kill web. Most people describe it as a kill web. And that's by 2027. And that's an incredibly important and very welcome development because it then allows you to plug sensors, shooters, headquarters into that web. It makes the sort of targeting, the sort of autonomous warfare that you're seeing the Ukrainians do so well, practical and realizable for our armed forces.
What does a kill web actually look like? Is it one giant room with a million TV screens, or is it a bit of software that everyone can see on a computer?
No, so this is the idea that you can link any sensor, whether that's a small, cheap drone, whether it's an F-35 aircraft, whether it's a satellite, whether it's someone's mobile phone, to someone who makes a decision supported by artificial intelligence and machine learning, and then can trigger any what we call effector. So that could be electronic warfare, it could be a missile from a warship, it could be a missile or a bomb from an aircraft, or it could be a cyber attack. And you can converge all of that on a digital framework, a web that allows you to make the most of all of the forces you have. And it's what the Ukrainians are doing really well.
With our help, we had a fantastic example of just how you can harness new technology, modern technology for modern warfare this week, didn't we? It's a story that really gripped everyone's attention, the whole world's attention. Operation Spider's Web, which was Ukraine's quite brilliantly executed targeting of 41 of Russia's Cold War era long-range bombers. That's their claim anyway. An operation devised by their intelligence agency, the SBU. What more do we know about it?
Well, some people sort of describe it as Russia's Pearl Harbor. I think this is more like the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942, where the Americans launched a bombing raid to take the war home to Tokyo, deep in Japanese territory when no one expected it. And it really sent a shock. And this is kind of what the Ukrainians have done. So it was organized by Ukraine's security service called the SBU. They've been planning it for a year and a half. They hit 3 airfields, one of them over 5,000 kilometers away from Kyiv. From open source imagery, so we can confirm this, and there could be more than this, it's destroyed 6 Tu-95, so those are what we call Bear aircraft, and 1 damaged. 4 Tu-22M, so these are blinders, are destroyed, and 1 Antonov 12 heavily damaged. There could be more than that. And it was achieved by getting super cheap first-person viewer drones, so a few £100 each, into Russia, hiding them in the roof of mobile wooden cabins that were contained in trucks. The trucks drove them close to the targets. The drivers then left them. And once everybody involved was safely out of Russia, the whole thing was done remotely. So the roof peels back and off go 117 drones. and they hit these aircraft and destroy, well, we'll see how many in the long term. And these are aircraft, these were legitimate targets because they were, they're capable of carrying both conventional and nuclear weapons, but these are the aircraft that have been launching cruise missiles against Ukraine.
And the bravery of those guys driving those vast lorries, shipping containers really, huge distances across Russia, knowing if they were caught, they would be tortured and executed.
Well, they might have been Russian drivers doing it.
Good point.
We don't know. But the key thing is, this is about stealth. It's about ingenuity. It's about thinking indirectly and unilaterally. It's the sort of raid that has been done historically in warfare. It's just been done in a whole new way.
And the cheapness. So these drones, 120 of them, something like that. Say they cost even $1,000. That's $120,000. Maybe chuck in another $50,000 for your 3 or 4 lost lorries. I mean, the whole thing costs no less than $200,000 to destroy billions worth of Soviet, now Russian, highly valued aircraft.
Yeah, and I can tell you that there will be air forces and probably navies around the world, staff officers working late into the night to try and work out their own vulnerabilities and preventing it, because this could happen anywhere at any time.
Including the Royal Air Force, thinking maybe we need to put some shelters over our typhoons and the like, probably.
We might be talking about that, Tom.
Okay, so those are the threats. They're fairly scary. Some of them also very imminent. Let's look at our side of the fence now, Britain's side of the fence, if you like, and ask if the defence view makes us ready to handle them.
Yeah, we can quite crudely split this into home, so the defence of the UK, and abroad, our ability to project force and to fight wars overseas. How about you go first with home, Tom?
Okay. It's an area that the SDR has got quite a lot to say about, actually, the need to quite seriously increase our protection of critical national infrastructure, CNI. So that's power stations, water supply, our communication networks, transport networks as well, transport main hubs, without which the UK would quite quickly stop running if those were attacked and destroyed.
So a bit like the Spanish power grid.
Absolutely. Yeah, very good example.
Yeah.
Which went down to some catastrophic effect for an afternoon last week, and we still don't really know why. But anyway, a very good example. So the report talks about the need for a more focused and substantive body of work to make our CNI more secure. There's a particularly scary box. It's quite easy to read on page 31 of the SDR, which jumped out at me. Someone obviously insisted this must go in to really paint the picture of what the potential threat is here. And it's so, I'm going to read a bit of it. It says this: based on current waves of war, if the UK were to fight a state-on-state war as part of NATO in 2025, it could expect to be subject to some or all of the following methods of attack. Attacks on the armed forces in UK bases, air and missile attack, long-range drones, cruise, ballistic missiles targeting military infrastructure and critical national infrastructure, and increased sabotage and cyber attacks. So there it is, writ large. Now, the SDR does propose some things to face all this. Partnerships with industry in terms of greater protections for CNI hubs, a new guard force made up by reservists, rudely referred to in some newspaper reports as a dad's army, the start of a citizen army, if you like. As a certain general put that a couple of years back, I forget his name now.
Yeah, I might have led to a few bollockings from Number 10 and other parts of the MOD establishment.
Why were you bollocked by Number 10?
Because they weren't expecting it. The irony was that 2 months later, they then used that announcement in the as the lead item in the Conservative manifesto.
Funny old thing. So on that point, we've had an email from a listener, Keith, who says to us, "Hello, Tom and Sir Patrick. I very much enjoyed your first episodes," which is very kind of him. "The UK has traditionally taken a different approach to homeland defence and preparedness than other European countries, particularly in Scandinavia and the Baltics. With the number of uniformed personnel at their current numbers, do you see a need to put more investment into a better prepared civilian population?"
Well, hi, Keith, and thanks for the question. So first of all, I think the Strategic Defence Review really has spotted this, and there's a lot in there about the need to begin to re-educate the UK's population, because they're very distant from defence and security. It doesn't preoccupy people's attention very much of the time, and they don't understand why these threats are emerging and what needs to be done about it and why they should pay for it. Now, Sweden and the Nordics, or all of the Nordic states, but in Sweden is a good example, do this really well. So Sweden have this notion of total defense where the whole of society and the whole of the national enterprise is geared first and foremost towards defending Sweden. And they keep the population informed. And as a result, there's a very high level of support for defense and security in Sweden. Finland is probably the best example. So Finland, first of all, it's had to be self-sufficient, self-reliant, really, since the Winter War. It's had to live next to Russia. And so they are truly well prepared. I mean, they have got...
You know a lot about Finland. Percy, you spent some time there.
Well, I spent a lot of time in Scandinavia, not least because I'm half Norwegian and grew up there when I was a child. But of course, when Sweden and Finland decided that they were going to accede to NATO, there was a period of risk for them before NATO could formally approve that, where the British government, I think it was led by Boris Johnson at the time, signed a defence pact that we would cover them until they were into NATO. And that meant that a lot of us, and me leading the army, spent a lot of time with the Swedish army and the Finnish army, trying to reassure them, training alongside them and helping them prepare for the accession. And they're both super professional. I mean, they're really admirable armies.
In Helsinki yourself, in meeting rooms, trying to put together a plan.
Deep underground. So, they have got command bunkers for the military, for government. So they are prepared for an attack and for bombing attacks. They have shelters, civil defense shelters for almost the entire population, about 4.8 million people. And of course, they run national service and they have reserve forces. So although they've got a small standing army, they can mobilize 250,000 people in the space of 8 weeks. And the level of support for that in
250,000 Finns,
yep,
going from driving buses, working in offices, to wearing uniforms and holding weaponry in a couple of months.
They've got a total of 900,000 that have been trained because they've all been through national service. And the immediate reserve is 250,000 people. We can't do that.
Wow. It should be said, historically, the Finns have been fighting the Russians for several centuries on and off, so they're quite good at the threat from their neighbours. If that's their homeland on land, if you like, the CNI, that's also protecting our skies above our homeland, air and missile defence. So that's obviously very pertinent these days, the threat from hypersonic missiles, which travel at 5 times the speed of sound. And as Richard Barron's, one of the SDR authors, was quite keen to say several times on the launch, they are currently 90 minutes away from the UK as we speak.
Yeah.
So the SDR proposes things to tackle this, the continued development of something called the Dragonfire laser system. And that's Britain. Britain is a leader in laser technology and warfare. The MOD put out a video 6 months back of a laser shooting down targets, which is phenomenal. It's very, very short range, though, of a few kilometres or so. There's also £1 billion of new funding for air defences in the SDR. The government made that announcement with some pride. But it does fall quite considerably short of building our own Iron Dome, the great big protection system that Israel has to shoot down anything incoming, that Ukraine is desperately trying to put together, and that Donald Trump said the US is trying to try and put together. But Patrick, I think some people might wonder, why should we not be building our own Iron Dome when those hypersonic missiles are only potentially 90 minutes away from us?
Well, there's a number of reasons for it. I mean, the first is just scale. So Israel is much, much smaller. I think the traditional geographic comparison to any country is Wales. I think it's about the size of Wales, possibly smaller. The UK is much, much larger and harder to defend. The cost is likely to be astronomical. So we are talking billions. And of course, even with the uplift in defense spending, you've got to make trade-offs about this. But also because you conduct air defense in a number of different ways. And it's not just about having interceptors and a missile system. It is about having an integrated air defense network. There's a command and control system. You need airborne early warning. And the best way to deal with this is actually to have your own offensive capabilities, our own long-range missiles. So this is partly what these 7,000 new missiles that we listed up front are about.
Okay. There remain, sadly, shortfalls on our own air defences there as well. And the third part of Homeland Defence is, of course, protecting our waters, fishing, etc., but absolutely pertinent these days, undersea cables, of which our whole world is conducted, especially to and from the US through the Atlantic. And the SDR has provision for that. There's a new operation called Atlantic Bastion, which is the Royal Navy's plan to secure the North Atlantic and what lies underneath it. And also, of course, we're building up to, let's come back to that phrase, that wonderful political phrase, we're building up to 12 new attack submarines, not 12 on the dot, so we could expect the number to fall, sadly. One potentially every 18 months. So it's a plan, but it takes ships, it takes autonomous platforms.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing about this, because the Navy is not going to expand to an enormous size. We don't yet know. That's what for the MOD to determine as it gets to the next step. But there will be, I suspect, some uplift. But a lot of that will be required to make sure that it's patrolling the Atlantic, to protect the carriers if they deploy as carrier strike groups. So one of the smart ways the Navy is trying to get after this is by doing this autonomously. So using autonomous platforms and this network of sensors so that you can counter this sort of home waters threat and the underwater infrastructure, and not draw your surface combatants away.
Great idea. No numbers again.
No, and no time frame.
No time frame. Let's touch on nuclear deterrence, which is both homeland and abroad, but it's the absolute pivotal cornerstone of Britain's defence. It's continuing. That's the good news. In fact, there's a lot of money going in from the government to rebuilding or replacing our nuclear warheads, £15 billion. Now, that is money that absolutely had to be spent because they're creaking and they desperately do need that sort of updating. They're not talking about warhead numbers. We think there's around 225 warheads at the moment. That number may go up or down, but as Simon Case was also telling us, very interestingly, the new policy of return to ambiguity means that we'll hear nothing more of that. And updating the current 4 Vanguard nuclear submarines carrying our Trident missiles, our continuous at sea deterrent, will be moved on to the Dreadnought for new subs. So an example here of what did get chopped for an earlier version. It was expected, in fact, I'm told very strongly, that it was written into an earlier version of the SDR that we would have a second form of delivering those nuclear weapons, air delivery. And basically the plan was, if something goes wrong with the nuclear subs, we need to be guaranteed we can retaliate with a nuclear strike with something else. So we're going to buy F-35A stealth jets from Lockheed Martin, American planes, and then strap US-made thermonuclear gravity bombs to them. They're called B-61s. That bit was in there. You open the documents on Monday. Strangely, it completely vanished with some amorphous reference to we'll talk to NATO about expanding access to NATO programs. It does mean the same thing, but it's more of an ambition again and a hope than actual delivery.
And this is what I meant by the Whitehall blanderizer. You know, all of the hard edges, I think, have been sanded down. And, you know, I hear that there's a certain amount of frustration from the team that put this together, that things like those hard targets and dates and timelines and deadlines, you know, did get taken out, much as this one here was taken out.
So that's the UK's homeland security, homeland being an American word, but it's kind of fair. What, Patrick, is the landscape like when we look abroad? Our own ability to warfight and, you know, what NATO wants from us as our contribution to the alliance.
Yeah, and this is the away dimension. I mean, you know, because you and I talked about this, that I'm not that comfortable with the sort of home and away distinction, because when you're talking about Euro-Atlantic security, we live in the Euro-Atlantic. So NATO is as important to us. NATO, our defence relies on NATO. The UK is defended by NATO plans. So you can't talk about us gifting forces to NATO, because NATO protects the UK as much as NATO protects the Baltics, Estonia, or anywhere else. Now, what this review does really clearly is it prioritises. And it says the Euro-Atlantic is where the most urgent threats are and where we must focus, and it's where we live. So that's meant that it's declared this thing called NATO first. And if you're going to put NATO first, it means you have to put what NATO needs from the UK first as well. So what does NATO need from the UK? 3 things above all. It needs the nuclear deterrent. It needs that to be hidden, operating continuously, so it's a continuous at-sea deterrent. It needs to be reliable, and it needs to be declared to NATO. That's thing 1. And this review very clearly prioritises that, and rightly so. The second thing that NATO needs above all from the UK is we keep the Atlantic open, so that we've got freedom of manoeuvre, so that we can reinforce from the United States if needed, and we hold off the Russian threats from the Kola Peninsula in particular. And then the third thing it needs, and this is equally important, is providing one of the two strategic reserves for corps on land. So what's a corps? A corps is a force that is at least 2 divisions in size. It can be up to 50, 60, 70,000. You can be bigger than that if you need. And it's the thing that would be available to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the most senior general in Europe, and to NATO, to either act as a reserve or to be maneuvered to block. So those are the 3 things that we've got to provide. Those are the things that we have to prioritize and in a time frame of relevance.
And what does that mean for actual hard capability? And I know journalists like me, we love talking about tank numbers, troop numbers in the army. And I know the likes of you say, well, that's all a very old-fashioned way of looking at it. But actual hard things, troops, tanks, etc., stuff that holds ground, we still need all that. So what is your take on what the SDR says on that? Do we have enough troop numbers? That's going from 73 to 76,000, but no time soon, maybe in 2030 if we're lucky, says the Defence Secretary. What about tanks, artillery pieces, armoured personnel carriers? Have we got enough of all of those under this plan?
No, we don't. We need more, and there are a number of programs that refresh and renew those capabilities and grow the numbers, but there are some capability gaps. So the trick is not to think purely in terms of old-fashioned terms in the number of tanks and artillery pieces we have, important though they are. It's that recognizing it's going to take time to regrow these capabilities because the industrial base hasn't been fully fired up yet. How can you deliver the effect of those traditional formations in a different way? The third thing that we need from NATO, or the NATO needs from us, is the forward land forces. That's the forces that we have deployed in Estonia to deter Russia from going after the Baltic states. And that is very much on the front line and is right in the path of what could be an opportunistic grab that I described earlier from Russia. So that has to be ready, and it has to be ready now. It certainly has to be ready in the time frame we were describing earlier on. And the truth is, we have a crisis of readiness for the NATO task that we have. So this is the point that I'm coming back to with this review, because at the moment it's privileging those exquisite long-term capabilities which come in the 30s and the 40s. There is a risk that it doesn't have the urgency. It's not a risk. It doesn't have the urgency to deal with the immediate term threats, and they're not clearly prioritized in the Strategic Defence Review. It's
disappointing, isn't it, that the timeframes are missing, the numbers are missing. Every single area we look at, really great. Some bits and bobs that are useful and important, but vast tracks, the metrics, presumably cut and pasted out by, what was your word for it? The cruncher?
The blanderizer.
Where is the blanderizer? Is it in a big cupboard somewhere?
It's usually sitting in the Cabinet Office or the Treasury.
And it's like a shredder, a giant shredder, which all good plans go to their deaths. But the blanderizer has basically got the metrics and all this, isn't it?
It probably has, yeah. So that answers, are we ready for the threats? And I think we agree that while the SDR goes some way in terms of what we need, it falls down quite heavily on the how and the when. So let's look, over the fence, as it were, and see what our NATO allies are doing to face down these same threats. And the comparison is quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And actually, this has changed dramatically in 10 years. When 10 years ago, I was writing stories about, appalling NATO countries, only 3 or 4 NATO countries are hitting that 2% target of national income on defence spending of GDP, which was considered a big deal at the time. Britain was one of those 3 or 4, along with the US, Greece, and a Baltic, I think. Now, NATO countries, European NATO countries, they've really got this, especially in the last year or two with Ukraine and Donald Trump speeding forward the panic, if you like. And they're overtaking us. They're overtaking us at a great rate. We're now 9th in the table of NATO defence spending per percentage of GDP. Germany, for example, they're probably the biggest uplift of all. They now spend more than us in pounds and pence on defence, $86 billion annually versus our $81 billion, and their number is going up and up and up. They've got the world's 4th largest defence budget. In France, Emmanuel Macron, he's already come out to say he wants to spend 3.5% of GDP today on defence. Remember, the British government is currently spending 2.3%, and Keir Starmer promised in February to go up to 2.5% in 2027, and ideally 3% by the end of the next parliament, but it's an ambition, and that all got heftily debated throughout all the newspaper pages and the media. But a great contrast from Macron there, from Germany, Poland, its defence budget 4.1% already. The Baltics, Latvia 3.1%, Estonia 3.1%. Lots of percentages and numbers that I could go on and on and on for. But by all accounts, the UK is now falling behind and ever greater behind. And this defence review, with no numbers to increase that, is just going to continue that fall down the table, embarrassingly.
And as you say, there was a lot of debate over the last couple of days about NATO's target of, or intending to set a target of 5%. So that's 3.5% on military capability, 1.5% on related spending. So think hospitals, railways, ports, that sort of infrastructure. They'll define it more clearly. And there was quite a lot of sort of slightly breathless commentary around suggesting that this was an MOD-inspired ambush to try and force the Prime Minister and the Chancellor's hand on a declaration. I mean, I don't think that's the case. This has been discussed openly, not in secret, in capitals for months. You know, NATO hasn't done anything wrong. This is preparing themselves for a summit. Most of the member states are in support of it.
This is the leaders' summit at the end of June, where all the NATO leaders, Donald Trump, Keir Starmer, meet in The Hague. So
the question is really one of why were we surprised? Because we've known it was coming.
Not least because Mark Rutte, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, now the new Secretary General of NATO, wrote to Keir Starmer to say, I'm going to propose 3.5% plus the extra 1.5 on infrastructure, etc. And you better be ready to get there.
Yeah. Say, Tom, where does the money come from?
Yeah, well, look, that we do have to ground this in reality, in political reality, because defence generals, defence correspondents, dare I say, can too often live in a slight world of Shangri-La where we want everything and we must have everything, and how we pay for it is someone else's problem. And that's not the current world, where Britain's finances, so many other Western countries' finances are under a real stretch. And to be honest, to pay for all this would cost an absolute fortune. Look at the problem the government has got now, bringing back winter fuel payments for a few hundred million, a huge row going on that. The sort of size of the figures here are astronomical. So you know what they'll say to you, General. Here's my devil's advocate hat on. How on earth are you going to pay for this? What taxes are you going to put up? What spending are you going to cut? What hospitals are you going to close? What schools are you going to not build? What railway lines are you going to delay? Because those are the actual hard choices that politicians face.
Yeah, and I'm a taxpayer too. So this affects me just as much as anybody else. But the reality is, first of all, we've been living in an era where we've had the luxury of getting a defence dividend, or peace dividend, if you like, and we've flowed all that money towards social spending, to welfare, areas that are more about plowshares than they are about swords. And the world's just changed. And what more evidence do you need? I mean, look at what is going on around you. You've got a strategic defence review that has told you in unbelievably stark and clear terms what the threats are. You've got threats going on, threat assessments going on all around Europe and amongst all of your allies, saying this could happen imminently. It could happen in the next few years. We know how hollow we are. I mean, if not now, then when?
And the Treasury's response is, yes, we get all that, but none of this is necessarily going to happen. Russia may not invade the Baltics. China may not invade Taiwan. Everything may be happy and smiley. And then we just blown a massive amount of money for nothing.
For an insurance premium. The problem with deterrence, or the good thing about deterrence, is that if it works, you never have to go to war.
And by having that deterrence, you also lessen the chance of war, because people won't want to fight you.
Exactly.
Right, okay. I'll take the devil's advocate hat off now, because, as you know, I think I rather agree on this. The other point I make is that let's not have too much sympathy for the Labour government. They've inherited a terrible financial mess of the country post-COVID, post the gas price shock, etc. But they were warned about this. There were certain generals making speeches about it a couple of years ago. I was writing columns about it in papers. Many, many others were, that we needed to dramatically increase our defence spending. So they chose not to do this. They chose to ignore those warnings, not put any of that in the Labour manifestos. And other NATO countries have done it. They've already made those hard choices. So actually, it can be done.
So on that note, shall we call it? Are we, Tom, in fact, running out of time?
Yeah, this is the bluff, which is the Patrichism for bottom line up front, which I learnt last week. My military vocabulary is increasing week by week. But the answer to our question is, yes, we are running out of time. And I think we've demonstrated that in a quite frightening way. Here is the thing, though. It is fixable. It can be fixed if the government moves very fast and very decisively now. So in my view, the first thing they have to do is fix the money problem. So we're talking about precisely how much we need. Well, the MOD also told us they had their own number in the SDR, which vanished, which is 3.6% of GDP, kind of where Mark Rutte wants us to be in NATO. That is an increase of 40 to 45 billion pounds every single year. But those hard choices have got to be made. And to quote Leon Trotsky, which I don't do too often anyway, really, but he said this wonderful phrase that gets repeated down the ages: you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you.
Yeah. So I think we're running out of time. The issue for me isn't all about the quantum of money, although that's important. It's all about time. It's the timing of when we start the investment, and it's about the profile of the money, because you can fiddle the figures so that you don't end up spending that money until 2035, and we need to front load the spending. Now, we can't re-equip the armed forces with new kit, brand new, shiny, expensive kit in time, because the production takes time to step up. We have to get the factories, we have to get the forges running. So we are going to be fighting with the legacy equipment, not all the legacy, some of it very good, but the equipment that we have over the next few years. As Don Rumsfeld said, you go to the army, go to war with the army you have, not the one you want to have. But the Strategic Defence Review, the document itself, contains the answer for how you do it. It talks about rapid approvals for procurements within 3 months. So there's another bit of jargon, of terminology I'm going to teach you now, Tom.
Oh, great. I get two in 2 weeks.
We almost do one each week. This one is called JFDI.
JFDI. Joint Force something? No, I give up.
Just effing do it.
Keep it clean. Okay. Well, there we go. There's our summary of the SDR and where we need to go with it. And there, I think we must wrap up this podcast. Thank you for listening. Do email us with your thoughts on this and everything else at generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk, generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. And we'll be back next week. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Tom. See you next week.